Thanks, Kim. The story of the smarter city is really the story of networks. In ancient times, these networks were the viaducts of Rome, or more recently, subways and giant systems in cities. But today, these intangible networks, the ones that you're building and that are being deployed now, are the core of what's making us smarter. And the key thing about this is everybody has a role in it. A smart city is not something that is sold by a company to a city. It turns out to be all of the heterodox networks and all of the data. It involves students and government officials and startups, as well as great networks. And the art in all of this, the art is really, how do you program a city? How do you use all of this? So that's why I'm kind of so excited to be here today, because who spent more time investing in and deploying networks than all of you? The modern era of all this really starts with ubiquitous networks. And on September 7th, 2006, something happened that was kind of completely new in the human experience. Now, that was the World Cup going on in Europe, and it was Italy versus France. The game was being played in Berlin, and in Rome, all sorts of people were watching and texting each other. And Telecom Italia partnered with MIT, and they anonymously grabbed all the text messages to take a look at what were the conversations people were having in Rome. Not the content, but their excitement. So the game goes on, it goes into overtime, there's a second overtime, and all of a sudden, people start texting each other, and then the French player, Zidane, gets the red flag. France is out, and Italy wins, and suddenly you see kind of the whole place going nuts. It was kind of the first time in history you could sentiently watch what was going on in a city, seeing the emotions, and realize the city was kind of an intelligent structure. Now, all of that is what you would think of as byproduct data. It was waste. It was just kind of the metadata residue of texts. But it turns out in ecologies, one person's waste is somebody else's food. And it turns out that this exhaust data that we cast off every day as we use the internet or our cell phones can be incredibly instructive. So meet my friend, Dr. Sandy Pentland at MIT, and here's how he's using that to look at public health problems.
You know, we go around in our lives and we have some sense of what's around us, but we don't have the big picture. By aggregating and averaging this data, though, you can do things like you can tell, well, are the people in this city block healthy? I mean, let's think about Hong Kong and SARS. You know, at one point, suddenly everybody in an apartment building got sick and didn't go to work. And nobody noticed that for a couple weeks, actually. But if you were aggregating this data, that would have stood out like a flare. It would have said, wait a second, there's some sort of disease going on here.
So the very fact that people weren't going out was a clue. And it turns out that this can be used in many ways. The Defense Department has funded capabilities that can determine, are you depressed, based on, is your social network changing? Are you communicating differently? Now you can also find out unemployment based on people's behaviors down to the block level, so much faster than waiting for a financial crisis to happen and measuring it years later. I had this experience recently when I was working with the United Nations on how they could use data to alleviate crises, and it turns out that social data, the tweets and the posts that we use, can solve a problem like this. Now, in particular, it's Germany. In 2011, 3,200 people get sick with E. coli, and 39 of them die. It's an enormous outbreak. You can imagine the pressure that Germany is under, and they have to take action, and they do. They blame Spain. They say it was Spanish cucumbers. Now, this is completely wrong, but you can imagine a government official has to do something quickly, and you operate under such limited data in public health. People have to get sick, they have to go to the hospital has to report it, and by the time you realize it's a problem, what do? Meanwhile, in California, at Epidemic IQ, they are monitoring tweets and blog posts, and they're looking for words consistent with people getting sick, and they see hotspots delivering and coming up in northern Germany. They're also picking this stuff up about 9 days before the public health officials are doing it. And it's also becoming pretty clear to them this has nothing to do with Spain, it's originating in Saxony, which it turns out where the problem came. So this is another example of kind of data that makes our cities smarter. In fact, data can reveal so much stuff that is unseen and lets us ask questions in our cities we couldn't before. For example, everybody knows about the global supply chain. This last election was completely consumed with where is stuff manufactured and is that the right thing? But where does stuff go when we throw it out? Well, we'd have no idea because who tracks the garbage? Well, what if we could add the internet to trash? What if we could make trash smart and have it tell us where it went? That would open up whole new vistas to understanding how to manage a city. And that's what MIT did when they put the guts of a cell phone and GPS in 3,000 pieces of garbage, had basically people in Seattle bring it all to them, and then they deployed it into the trash system. Here's what happens. So the trash, two big observations. One, they find a whole lot of illegal dumps near Seattle because the trash went there. And two, there's a whole class of trash that is going all across the United States, and it reveals a hidden ecosystem and economy around high-value trash, like cell phones and batteries and printer cartridges. Based on this, you're able to manage things more differently and efficiently, and people can take different actions. They're aware of the fact that it may not be that ecological. One example of this happened in Helsinki. This is the power plant, and the more energy that people save, the bigger that green thing is. Those are high-powered lasers projected on steam. It's kind of a game. The bigger you get it, the more energy you're saving. And then they had one night where they had everyone do it, and the thing was completely huge. But this is an example of using games or using data to tell a story to make cities better. So what have we seen so far? Exhaust data can give you insight. It can render a city manageable. But another thing that we're finding is when a city opens its data, it's an invitation. It's a platform for more people to participate. This was seen very well in Fukushima during the nuclear disaster when the government couldn't or wouldn't tell people where the radiation was. So a whole bunch of people got radiation monitors and iPhone attachments, and it was basically a bunch of worried moms that generated the data that let them take action. I had a similar experience in San Francisco. When we opened our data, the first thing that people noticed when they looked at crime data is that the crime of prostitution was being committed once a month from north to south on San Pablo Avenue. And the residents of Oakland went to the police and said, you know, we're concerned about public safety. That doesn't appear to be criminal behavior. That seems to be lazy policemen checking off a list. And that feedback loop was fixed and the policing changed. Many of you run open innovation centers where you invite entrepreneurs and the public in to co-create with you. And we do the same thing in cities. We call them urban hackathons. We did a project in San Francisco with the Gray Area Foundation for the Arts that mapped all the crime in our city. And I was very worried because we're right where all the crime is downtown. And I'm like, when we publish this, people are going to yell at me because I'm calling attention to something. Boy, was I wrong. Turns out people came in and the police were like, I made that arrest. And families were like, someone's paying attention. So it turns out when you open these things up and you make stuff smarter, more people get involved. We had another idea. All right, if the government isn't measuring it, let's do it ourselves. We deployed a whole bunch of microphones and our own network in the neighborhood to figure out what was noisy. We then found out where the noise was, and we turned back to City Hall and we said, now we know where the noise pollution is, you can go enforce it. Empowering stuff. Sometimes the most interesting things that happen that show us how we can manage come out of a crisis. Hurricane Sandy, 2012, and here in Washington, D.C., FEMA had to send gas trucks up to the open gas stations because many were closed because they were flooded, but there was a problem. How do you know the open gas stations when no one's measuring this and the electricity's down? At the White House, we actually tried to get the data from your colleagues at AT&T and Verizon, figuring where the phones were all piling up, they'd be queuing up for gas. But because of privacy and other reasons, we couldn't get that. And so then I sent an email off to Waze. How many people use Waze, the traffic app? All right, well, Waze knows where people are, and they can spin on a dime. So that evening, they basically wrote a new portion of Waze. They had people check in the open gas stations, and they used the data. And by the middle of the next day, we had found all of the gas stations. Cities are putting in place networks for managing cities. We call them the Internet of Things or machine-to-machine communications. And the great question for all of us in this room who programs things is, how do we program this Internet of Things or IoT network? now here's the near future problem with this. You try to deploy a new network in a city where you need to get the sanitation department, the lighting people, and the public works people to agree. We tried this for 3 years in San Francisco, and we gave up, so we went over the top. We basically said to a vendor, put your IoT network in the libraries, because they're a neutral space. And then we said to developers and city officials, program to this, let's see what happened. So we basically deployed a network for a whole series of purposes. Let Miguel Gamino, our Chief Information Officer, tell you about it.
There are real-world examples for IoT applications right now. And those things are smart lighting, smarter transportation systems, parking applications, trash collection. There's all kinds of public service and city infrastructure use cases.
Just before going to the bed, and by tapping on the main...
So this
we
was
work with our library system to deploy antennas on a number of libraries to create a network that now covers all of San Francisco.
So we actually didn't know what would this be good for. So we deploy it, and a year later we start seeing what comes in. And now here's the question. It's a year into the network. What's the hit? Remember, our network is a year old. It's about as old as television was when Milton Berle showed up. So what was the award-winning app on our network? It turns out to be sewage. It turns out sewage has a very long run in cities, and if you think about it, no one knows what's going on down there, and since we're a city surrounded by water on 3 sides, finding out and putting a network in where the batteries last for 20 years and you can get data in real time is transformational. And nothing's more transformational in cities than mobility, which is being driven by pervasive data, ubiquitous networks, and processing power. And one of the interesting questions is, how would you figure out how much a city could share vehicles? We hear about autonomous vehicles and new shared vehicles. How do you figure that out? I was working on an experiment a few years ago in Singapore. Fujitsu had a model that, if you gave it data, could tell you how many people in the city could share. But Japan didn't have the data to give them. Singapore said they come up with the data, and Singaporeans are obsessed with taxis. It's how you get around. So in one afternoon, we loaded the data in, and we immediately saw, simply on cell phone pairs, where people were moving in town and how quickly they were moving. You could find out 15% of all traffic went from about the same place to the same place. It's what we now think of as Uber Pool or Lyft line. At the time, we couldn't imagine how would we get people to get into a stranger's car and behave differently. But of course, they are, and these new services prove it. One of the interesting things about this is it starts skewing public policy. For example, these new forms of transportation like Uber compete with public transit. And this creates a problem because a city needs to provide transit to people who can't afford it or might be underserved. It turns out you can take this same capability and use it to modify the actual nature of public transit itself. We call this mobility as a service, and it's literally making buses follow people or chase them. So think of going from lots of big buses to many smaller ones that kind of open it up, and it turns out that becomes much more fluid. After all, why chase the bus when the bus can chase you? And the data seems to show that if you go to this open distributed approach, you can get people there faster, get them serviced sooner, and it's essentially an open way of beginning to reimagine transit. I began this talk by talking about the fact that we're not just in an era of smart cities, we're in an era that cities start to make people smarter. And if you think about Liam's talk earlier, there are all these incredible capabilities that are coming on now that empower people. We call this the maker city. It's the ethos of the maker movement applied to cities. And about 2 years ago, with the help of the White House, we had 100 mayors take a pledge, and they said, we'd like to make our cities smarter, and through STEM education, maker spaces, local manufacturing, like you heard from Local Motors, we think we can reinvigorate and reinvent our cities. And to me, this is one of the most exciting developments on the horizon today, powered by your networks. One of the great examples of this is Pittsburgh, and in particular, the Elizabeth Forward School District, that's kind of in more rural and not as well off. They said, what if we transformed education? Because they noticed kids weren't learning to say, they weren't paying attention, they were looking at their smartphones. What if we smashed art, computer science, and shop together and turned them into problem solvers and problem creators? And they have revolutionized that with what they call the Dream Lab.
The Dream Factory is a combination of 3 classes that were previously separated. The art room, the tech ed room, and computers.
All 3 teachers collaborate and bring together art and engineering.
When it's hands-on learning, it's something that you want to do.
What we need are measurements. When you have a board, take a look at your board.
I think it adds to our traditional wood shop, metal shop.
Students are programming interactive games, building robots.
Do they want to do 3D printing? Do they want to do painting? Do they want to do sculpture?
This is not a gifted program. It's not an after-school activity. Every kid is getting this in our school.
Now, it turns out when you do this, dropouts plunged, their ratings went way up, and importantly, it was funded by the district itself. It's kind of, it catches. And it also teaches kids to work together in teams. For example, Stinky there was drawn by a 2nd grader, and the 8th graders had to render it in 3D as a real project. In our cities, the spaces that we build reflect our values. In the Middle Ages, great cathedrals when God was at the center of everything. In the 20th century, cathedrals to commerce, shopping malls, and great office buildings. Today, increasingly, it's innovation spaces and maker spaces that lead our future. For example, in Cleveland, at Case Western Reserve, the Think Box hits about 30,000 people a year. It started as a bottom-up, inexpensive thing. It's now a $25 million center, and it's a full stack of reimagining how you invent in a city. Community people come in the bottom and have ideas. There's a prototyping lab to come up with new product ideas, not unlike we saw from Liam or from Local Motors today. And then on the next floor up, they start manufacturing things. There's another floor that's an entrepreneurial center that gives advice and helps find them funding, and then a startup space. This has become the most popular place on campus, and people go to the school for that. Across our nation, older space is being reimagined and reconfigured, just like this Dock 5 that we're in today. There's the Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, 3.5 million going to 5 million square feet. And in that space, the tech centers in Brooklyn come together with the 20,000 people that are in public housing, and they're beginning to reimagine both local manufacturing and the very empowering capability that making and maker cities have, kind of truly our next generation of smarter city. When I talk about a maker city, I think its biggest purpose is to prepare its people for the future, which sounds like a marketing line, but when you think of automation, AI, robotics, these rapid changes, our economy is going through the biggest change since the Great Migration. And the innovation happens in cities. And so by working on new forms of education and workforce, and by engaging people in the city itself, you start building not just a smarter city, but including everybody in it. To that end, and the next project we're doing in Maker City is next week on Tuesday, U.S. News. You probably all know U.S. News. They rank healthcare and they rank schools. We're launching continuing coverage of U.S. cities as maker cities. Essentially, what are these things that cities are doing that can prepare for the future, from networks to manufacturing to STEM, kind of all of these quality of life issues. We think when you add that up, we're moving from an era where cities get smart to an era where cities make us smart. They are the engines of the economy and creation, and there's a way of opening all of this up and empowering people that hit many of the themes that we've seen today that make cities ever more powerful and creative, take advantage of your networks, and truly make us a nation of maker cities. Thank you very much.